Welcome one, welcome all, one more time here on your favorite show, SANKOFA, on the Galaxy Universal Network, live from Johannesburg, here in Midrand, South Africa. We're excited to be with you on this beautiful, beautiful Sunday morning. It's cloudy here in South Africa, and we're just having one of the most beautiful weathers. If you are home, you want to make yourself some cup of coffee or make yourself some warm beverage there. Keep yourself warm and hug those that you love. I hope you're with the right partner, yeah? But hug those that you love and stay home and be nice for today. Today it's a different show, but exciting. We have SACC on the line with us. We have the African home building cultural perspective expert in the house. Better than that, also, we have a gentleman from Grace Point. It's a religious organization. And I will hand over the microphone to him for this conversation. I will tip in right towards the end there. Me and Tate Molo have other issues outside of this building that we're going to be dealing with. But for this show, I will allow it to run as we had planned. And we have Tate Sisiwane, who is on my extreme right. And they call him Lindo. Litlohonolo, which means blessings. Litlohonolo with me on the right. And I'll hand over the ropes over to you. And here on SANKOFA, looking backwards at the future, looking at some of the contemporary issues around COVID, family, churches, and how best we can begin to find a solution around the pandemic that is actually harassing the South African community. COVID-19, Corona is right here with us. And welcome to the show. Stay with us for the next hour or 2 hours. We're going to be breaking some bones and chewing some meat thereof. And I'll be there at the end to put some toothpicks and as we clean up the show. Have yourself a wonderful, wonderful morning. Stay with us. And over to you, Tadeli Tokonolo.
Thank you so much, Bishop Maponga. A good morning to everyone that is joining us today. And as Bishop Maponga has said, we've got Fundisi Molo, Reverend Molo, who is from the South African Council of Churches, and Mwandile Sacc. And together today, we're going to be exploring what it means for the church to respond ethically to the ongoing pandemic. For many of you guys at home, you might be thinking that we are almost there, it is almost over. But as some of us might have heard, that this is not the last pandemic we're most likely to have. We are in that age, and therefore it is important that we chew and understand what it means for the church to respond ethically during times like this. And so later on, we'll be joined by someone who will help us also explore, and the other side of the conversation we'll be exploring today as we speak about the closing of churches and whether it is the way that we are called to respond ethically. And so Fundisi Molo will be guiding us on that. Good day, Tatu Molo, welcome.
Good day, Litonolo, and good day to everybody listening.
And so, Tata, this is where we want to start with everyone that is here today. Is the first thing is we understand that the view that some people are of the notion that large gatherings, or rather religious gatherings, should not be easily categorized under large gatherings. That when we speak about large gatherings, we should have an exception to religious gatherings and perhaps not necessarily just place a uniform ban on all gatherings and make an exception for religious gatherings. So to shoot us off today, I just thought, can I hear what your heart is around this? Because I would imagine that this is where people are still stuck in this particular conversation.
You're referring to me?
Yes, please, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. Indeed, the South African Council of Churches, in its own reflections on the matter of how to deal with the COVID pandemic, from the last year, we've spent a lot of time to a process which we call See, Judge, Act. And that process implies for us the need to do observation, which is trying to understand for ourselves, what is this thing? How does this thing operate? And how does it impact on the lives of the people? And out of that, you then develop a theological response that allows you then to engage with it as best as you can. And thirdly, design actions that are going to help you as those who are part of the SACC respond as comprehensive as you can. And what we have then done is we have developed what we call a pastoral response that we have said with our member churches. And that one is one that is available in our website. From there, we developed what we had to deal with what is protocols that we as member churches of the SACC are going to employ in our response to what it might mean to gather as a congregation and as a people. And those recommendations were presented to government when we were still on lockdown level 4. And we made those recommendations for protocols and things that we will do, arguing to government that it should be possible for people to gather. And when people gather, these are the things that we can do as those who are in the SACC, who are able then to say, if you're going to gather, here are the protocols that we are going to follow. And those protocols have been popularized with our people, and some of them have engaged with them. And therefore, we moved from the basis that said it should be possible for people to gather, and when they gather, here are the protocols that we want to observe. So we have never had the stance that simply have a blanket thing that says people shouldn't be gathering. What we then did is to listen to what government is doing, and the notion that the SACC instruct government to do this or do that is not true. Secondly, the SACC speaks for those who are member churches of the SACC. It doesn't speak for every Christian. It doesn't speak for every gathering of those who are of faith orientation. It speaks to those who are members of the SACC. And when then the government then banned might not be a correct word, but when the gatherings were prohibited, the SACC was not consulted to say, what do you think, we want to close, to say yes or no. Like everybody else, we received the news as we have heard them. And therefore, we sought to understand what is it that informs that decision. And we're engaging with that even as we speak now, trying to engage government so that government is aware of the needs of the church and how the church can be allowed to operate, not only in terms of worship, but to be a place of renewed thinking, renewed engagement, and reimagination of what it is to be a community who's lived under this pandemic. And that is the general stance of the SACC.
Thank you so much, Bob Molo. And then I would imagine, other arguments that we've had come out from people who would prefer that churches gather. And I'm asking this because I would love to hear your thoughts around it. I would imagine that these are things that you've considered. They argue that, one, you look at in Iran, where because of a religious leader that then invited people into the worship space to say, come to a space of healing. That resulted in one of the major outbreaks in Iran. You look at a similar situation in Malaysia, Pakistan, and in India, where you had religious scholars who were gathered, and which resulted in an outbreak, particularly also in India. That some would then argue that, but that was at the beginning of the pandemic, before churches knew how to manage the virus. And we think that churches are more capable than they were at the beginning of the pandemic. Another example they would make of are issues such as the one we had in Free State, where there was a gathering right at the beginning of the pandemic, and it resulted in several people being infected with the virus. But then whenever you raise these gatherings as an example of why it might not be the best idea for churches to gather under the circumstances, the argument that is then raised is churches were not capable, did not have the knowledge on how to manage the situation then. They are, however, in a different situation as we speak. How do we then process that? How do we then continue to say, perhaps let's not gather in light of that argument?
I repeat, Lieutenant, as I indicated earlier on, the South African Council of Churches, I think around about August last year, if I remember well, the dates might escape me. In the anticipation of the need for us to live with the reality of the pandemic is not going to disappear tomorrow. The pandemic is not going to disappear even in the midst of the vaccine. The pandemic is not going to disappear. The SACC anticipated that. And because we anticipated that, we did our own due diligence in terms of engaging scientists who will inform us about how this virus operates, who will tell us how it engages and spreads in life. And out of that journey, we developed what we call protocols that we, for ourselves, we said, if you are going to be a church that is going to be opening and living with this, these are the protocols that we want to put in place, because we believe the church is a place of life. The church is not a place where death should be spread, but it's a place where life should be enhanced. And because we believe that, we then invested our own thinking about what does it mean. And we had a comprehensive document that moved from talking about, because the SACC has got diverse membership. It's got people who are in the Zionist movement, in the sense of worship tradition. It's got people who are in the Pentecostal movement. It's got people who are in the what we call now mission churches, other calling it is the colonizing churches. All of those churches are part of the SACC. So we developed a protocol that took into account what does it mean to have Holy Communion? What does it mean to worship? What does it mean to worship when you're worshiping in a mat, as you might be? So all those things were pulled together. And when they were pulled together, firstly, they were presented to government and say to government, these are the commitments we want to make to the church. And those commitments sometimes even go beyond what government expects of us. Because for the SACC, we owe our loyalty to life, not because government tells us to preserve life. We owe our loyalty to a God who says, I've come so that they must have life and have life in abundance. So our own standards are beyond what government might be asking or wanting, because our commitment is to a God of life, who creates life, who sustains life, who protects life, and that's what we do. So in dealing with that very same question, last year, as I say, around August, the SACC developed protocols that said people can gather, hear the protocols, a way of how it is to protect life. It has got people, how when do you attend church, how do you organize that? It has got how do you consult your doctors. All those things are part of what we have put before the government, before our member churches to respond to the need. We do say to government, please government, don't understand church as only as worship. Church life is bigger than simply worship. It is about counseling, it's about taking care of people in many different ways. So we need to find a way to make sure that our people are able to do ministrations that are going to give life to our people.
Babmulo, thank you for the clarity, because I think it moves us from the two extremes that suggest that maybe that the SACC's position is that there should be no religious gatherings at all. And perhaps I want to come to you now, Mkhudu, and find out from your side. You have seen a lot of patients, you have seen a lot of people. What has been the impact for those of us who belong to religious spaces that have chosen to not gather in light of the pandemic, even when churches were allowed to gather later last year? In your experience, what has been the impact on the individual not being able to access these spaces of healing, these spaces of gathering, these spaces that are so meaningful to their life journey on a Sunday?
I think for me, what this pandemic has done is it has made us to think about fellowship in a different way. It has made us to think differently about spiritual disciplines. It has made us to think differently about all the other things that we always look at when we think about spiritual well-being. So for me, what the pandemic has done, as a psychologist, number one, I have seen how people, to a certain degree, they feel misaligned, that there's something that people are used and conditioned to go to this space, as in church, as a form of fellowship, as a form of belonging. Now, if you take, for instance, in black churches or black communities, imitandas, or when someone has died, it would be a practice that after the service we'll go and pray for that person or with that person. That form of psychosocial, spiritual support in that sense has been taken away. Now, people have experienced a range of problems, significant number of losses that we haven't had the chance to grieve for those people that our friends, our congregants, and everything and everyone who's around us. So the people are deprived of exercising what it means to be human. People have lost the sense of what we deem as Ubuntu within the context of spirituality or in the context of theology. So that, for me, has led to another form of what I call spiritual depression. Because especially for those people who really believe that church serves as a center and display in a place that is a fountain of healing. Now, I can't get access to Mfundisi or my pastor because there are protocols. I can't be with my people that are around me, that I'm used to fellowship with. It adds another strain. So there's a degree and sense of isolation. Now, Bishop Maponga might not afford to come and see me because, for instance, I charge 1,300 to get a psychosocial support level from a psychologist. Now, I don't have that money. I don't have a minister. I don't have a community. So there's a sense of displacement. Another controversial thing that I've been thinking about, for me personally, subjectively, I have even wondered, as a Christian or someone that looks at the world from that world, do I need church for me to feel aligned and connected with God? No. However, I understand why the government has had to go to that extreme, because we're going to have many problems, we're going to have many debts and all of that. So, for me, as Umkulu, as you referred me earlier, I have never been so connected to my ancestors than I've ever been before. It's a different conversation because Umsamo is at home. I can go there at 3 a.m., 6 a.m., 9 a.m., or 3 p.m. and all of that. So I think beyond looking at the problem, Hloni, and you, Bishop, is that we need to think about what are some of the alternative ways of how we rethink fellowship. What are some of the ways in which we can think about how to connect with others without being a church physically? I mean, other churches have even gone far to virtual services. However, now I think people in also churches can think about how do we create spaces for pastoral care virtually. I may not be there to give this psychosocial support, but there's a virtual space for that. We might probably create spaces where ministers are available for at least for a certain number of time. At least 2 or 3 people a day are seen for pastoral care. But for me, psychologically, and as a psychologist, I'm sitting here, I have never seen a greatest number of people that I have seen since COVID.
Hold it right there. As the ministry is changing direction from physical body contact, as funerals, we no longer have after tears, where you can hug someone and they can cry on your shoulder. Now you can cry with an SMS, you can show your tears with an emoji, and you can send your condolences on Messenger and WhatsApp. How are we as Africans beginning to cope with this new form of electronic, virtual, spiritual, psychological support? Stay with us. We'll be back right after the break.
Make massive moves.
Isn't that your daughter's bib?
But the truth is, I feel like Arabella's always with me.
Don't you ever forget this man's face. He killed your brother.
Don't shoot! Please don't shoot! Don't shoot!
Make massive moves with Starside. Make massive moves.
So from the theater stage to the kitchen.
I'm anxiously awaiting to see Sanaya.
What else is this if not love?
Make massive moves with Starside.
As we are evolving and developing, and as we are changing our methods of interactions, and even in ancestral and traditional spaces where we used to give mkomboti and etc. Now the modern amadlozi, they also want ibels, bafuna some whiskeys, and they also now our ancestors are smoking white cigarettes. Interesting times. So culture, as it were, it is dynamic and it is changing. The question that we are trying to deal with right now is how, as the Christian community, are we responding to new forms of expression and support within the greater context and ambit of the COVID pandemic that we are facing. Over to you, Ntatili Tlohonolo.
Thank you so much, Bishop. And I want to pick up from that point when we speak about the whole idea of the evolution of culture, that culture is evolving and even how we do church is evolving. And right now the pandemic has forced us to even reimagine how we actually do church. Now, picking it up from there, we already know that Europe, many years ago, had already started flirting with the idea of a postmodern world with no religion. If you've heard John Lennon imagine a world with no religion where the people are one, I want to pick it up from there and reconcile that with the comments that you made, Mkulu. And I then want to speak about the idea of actually saying, could this pandemic and sometimes how we're responding to this pandemic, for instance, for those who are extremists that are saying, let us completely stop.
Because we're losing the chairman in a few moments.
Yes.
I want us to maybe direct the question and say, how is the church responding to the evolving of the church? Is the church prepared? Has the church put protocols in place? Because now we are in emergency protocols. But going forward, from his onwards, Corona is going to be here for a longer time. Are there proper procedures, training, development of the modern pastor to begin to deal and prepare himself for the church in the next 10, 15, 20 years, which is actually going to become a virtual church? I just thought
absolutely. So I think, Babu Molo, if you can pick up on that particular question and then also help us engage also with the idea of then saying, could the easing on religious gatherings encourage young people to begin to imagine a world with no corporate gathering, a world where spirituality is a private matter and not a corporate matter?
Thank you very much. The questions that you are raising, sorry, are questions that should occupy any serious-minded person in the world right now, because indeed, life as we know it, is gone. The social constructs that gives us a certain kind of meaning have been not only stretched by COVID-19, they have been strained to a point where they are unable to make true sense of how to respond to this. The notion of family, even in the context of funerals, is strained. How do you become a wife? How do you become a wife when you can't attend your husband's funeral because you are infected yourself, and therefore you must either depend on noise or your husband? It really stretches everything that we know of as life as we know it. Therefore, church itself, I would personally even go further. Faith itself will need to find a way to reimagine itself. What does it mean to believe in God? Before I came to this service, before I came to this conversation right now, I was listening in a virtual way, part of a covenant service in the Methodist Church of Southern Africa. And there are big questions we need to imagine for ourselves. What does it mean to believe in God? And somebody was preaching today and say God is in control. I am struggling in my mind to say, what does that mean? What does that mean to say God is in control and people are dying like they do? I'm almost tempted to go back to that Moses question before the church, before God. And when Moses is told to go back to the people in Egypt, people who have been in slavery for generations, and God says, go and tell them that I want to release them. And Moses' question simply is, who are you? Who are you? If I go to these people to tell them that you want them liberated, who are you? And therefore, we need to be asking these questions for ourselves in a deep, imaginative way to say, who is God? How do we relate with God? How do we understand God? And for me, this in the tragedy of the moment, this is a moment of fertile imagination for us to imagine in a fertile way. How do we talk about faith? How do we talk about love? How do we talk about family? And therefore, because we're in the genesis of this response, we as the SACC are challenging our member churches to say, we cannot go back to a life before COVID. We need to redefine what church is. The Methodist Church has got the presiding bishop who called on the Methodists to say, reimagine life, health and transformation. We need to talk about that. The way we train priests and pastors, we must engage what does that mean. So we are in a space of fertile reimagination that we're asking all our member churches to do. Young people must be in the forefront of the search for new ways of how to be community. Then we must be in the forefront of asking the question, what does it mean to be in community when proximity is a challenge? What does it mean for me to talk to you right now? And can I give meaning to that? That transcends the quest for feeling your touch, which is basically how we human feelings we perceive as being communicated. And that all of us have got that responsibility to do so. And the church itself, if it's serious about life, it has to generate for its own reflection a way that says, how do we inculcate life-enhancing ways that transcends physical life, but makes life, as Christ calls it, life in abundance? That's the challenge we all face. And the SACC is doing its own part. We engage the scientists to talk about what it means. We engage the technology people to talk about that. We are also calling on our theologians to stop going back to the platitudes of the past, but to find new language. If I can say something, Luciano, before I go, and this is a personal point of mine, the language of the past is insufficient to give expression to what we are going through right now. The metaphors of the past are not comprehensive enough to allow us to engage with the tragic moment of our reality currently. And it is our responsibility as this generation to develop new metaphors and new ways of being that speak to the depth of the crisis we go through, yet find the hope and the healing that transcends metaphors of the past.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Babumodo. I do not know if there's any other question before we allow you to go.
Just one. I know this is. I promised myself to be quiet. It's one thing to talk as administrators and planners. It's another thing to take this conversation into practical methodologies, where under the SACC, all the colleges, all the universities that are producing pastors, are we looking at a curriculum change of an e-based ministry, of a virtual kind of interaction? Are we looking at new methodologies of theologizing and beginning to build doctrinal understanding which responds to the pandemic at hand? Or we are responding to the pandemic in one little house on the other side, but the protocols in terms of our academic preparation of ministers still remains colonial and ancient, even as ancient as 14th, 15th, 16th century theology, which is still being taught to the student. Yet the student with an ancient theology must be responding to the 21st century challenges. Here we are arguing about dressing, about music, about trinities and all these things. And Corona looks us in the eye and there's no respect for the theological dogma that is there. So my question could be through you, Honorable Chair. Is it possible that the pandemic is actually giving, I like the word that he used when he said we're in a moment of creative reimagination. Is this creative reimagination reactive, or it is actually fundamental, theologically transforming, to say what form of theological transformation and dogmatic development do we need to develop a theology which responds to the 21st century pandemic? We still believe in baptism by immersion. You must be in the hands of a pastor, and the pastor must put you in the water, and then you are baptized. Now the patient has got corona and they are on their deathbed and they want to be baptized. Are we now beginning to rethink how do we baptize a member who is on a deathbed? They have 2 days to go. You as a pastor cannot touch them. They can't touch you because there's a pandemic. How do we respond theologically to some of these issues? To me, these are pertinent issues. People want to eat their sacraments. Mfundis must break the bread and put it in my mouth and eat. Now, I can't see you, I can't see me. Can we begin to move these services so that families can begin to conduct communion services by themselves? The list goes on and on and on. The question is, theologically speaking, how do we begin to frame, think, plan theological positions which positively respond to the pandemic, whereas ecumenical power has been locked up in the echelons of theological dogma and ecclesiastical leaders? Now that the leaders are being pushed out due to the pandemic, is it possible that theologically speaking we can begin to relinquish some of these powers to the husbands, to the fathers and the mothers in their homes, so that the church concept is moved from a building at the corner of Claim Street to an address in 72 Sunnyside, where a husband and his wife and children can begin to practice ecumenical and liturgical, rituals within the confines of their own homes.
Let us not even waste any time on that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. To respond to the bishop, let me just kind of clarify the SACC how it functions. Indeed, we do not call for dogmatic essentialism in the way we operate with our churches. We actually do not enter into doctrinal debates with our members because we represent a diverse group of people. But what I'm prepared to say to the bishop is that the pandemic itself is for me an intensifier. And indeed, what's the right word I'm looking for? It forces us to get our minds together. In the tradition of the SACC, if you go back in its own engagements, from the moment where we were talking and dealing with the crimes of apartheid, the commitment has always been to shift theological thinking away from dogmatic purity into praxis of liberation and of love. And because that has been our focus, we have been in constant contestation with what has been, if I'm frank, and that's where the bishop is correct, with the hegemonic power of the Western way of theologizing that has found its way not only to impose its will, but the way to adjust and even absorb the protests against its power and streamline it into its own ways of doing things. So we have been part of that great challenge, and as the bishop, as a student of history, will know that when you are dealing with a hegemonic presence, you are going to deal with it in constant struggles where the power itself wants to reimpose itself. So the SACC has always been committed to the liberation of what some of us call liberating the text from the hands of those in power into the hands of those who are vulnerable in society, such that those who are vulnerable in society are able to find liberative ways. And those of us who know some history will know that the greatest example of that is what was called the base community in Latin America, where because of the oppression, for example, of the Batista regimes in places like El Salvador and other places like in Brazil, where people will meet and find the liberative power of the text in the small communities that they gather for them to find the liberative power to journey with them. So the SACC has been part of that tradition that seeks to say that institutions are not meant to be prisons. They are meant to be facilitators of a deeper discovery of what it is to be a Christian in the world. So the SACC has been part of that. What the pandemic has done, even in the economic sphere, even in the social sphere, the pandemic says to all of us, your yesterday is not sufficient to deal with today. You either wish to go back to your yesterday and find ways to preserve your yesterday. And please remember, if you remain in yesterday, you'll be like one who's in a deep freezer who has no ability to change today because you are frozen in the past. Because what we need now is to find ways of being energized in a way that says, how do we make sure that an old person, I have been a pastor, fortunately I'm not a pastor right now of a local church, but how do you communicate love? Because ultimately, what is a sacrament? What is a sacrament? When we share bread, when we share wine, what are we doing there? We are not, let's go back to the joke that the bishop done. We are not just kind of trying to make you get blood and flesh. We are seeking to communicate to you in a metaphor. And that metaphor says, those in the Methodist Church believe that a sacrament is a means of grace, is a communicator of God's love and God's presence in the midst of our lives. So how do we then develop ways that communicate to people the mysteries of God's presence, even in the current context? A church, a denomination, an institution, a faith community that does not think to itself, how do we do with the technology as we have it? How do we fight with those who own data companies to take down the data? Because we don't want to create a situation whereby the church becomes the place for the elite, where the elite, because they've got access to data, are able to get to that. How do we speak to our public broadcaster and say to our public broadcaster, our people's faith is an essential part of who they are? How do we communicate to our people the sense of being community together? If a church doesn't think and apply the mind to the issues that the bishop is raising, that church is bound to die. That church will be irrelevant in the next 50 years of the life. A church that depends on certitudes, a church that belongs and say, I can stamp in my pulpit and shout at my pulpit that God is good all the time. That church is doing a disservice to God's people, because the God I believe in, the God that the SACC believes in, is a God who left heaven. Who left heaven. If you follow the Pauline tradition, if you follow Luke, he became Emmanuel. He decided to say, the lofty places of heaven are not the places where I need to be found. And this is the beauty of at least my understanding of the Christian faith. The Jesus who is born in the world is not born in any temple, is not born in any fleshy palace. Palaces and fleshy places are deliberately avoided by God. He is born with his family in a stable. With his family in a stable. That for me is the most powerful metaphor we can remind ourselves in. God's presence is not located in physicality in terms of buildings. How then do we then answer the questions that the bishop is raising? And I'm sure all of us have the responsibility to think. We are only a year into this pandemic. I always tell people, be very careful of building up answers that you believe answer everything, because you are going to be a fundamentalist who is dangerous to yourself. You need to be open to the reality that we are going through a pandemic where we need to find new information. If you indulge me, I was very disappointed with the discovery, the SACC is disappointed with the fact that when we said to our people, don't take the casket to home, please wrap people with plastics. We are very angry to discover right now that actually those people who were giving that scientific information, or those who recommended this, are kind of distancing themselves from that recommendation, because we know that our people have going to go back to Anele. We are dealing with the reality that our people haven't found closure. Because we're told, don't bring the casket home. Let it, if it's going to be there, let it pass there. Don't take it off the thing. And our people have cried tears because they've not been able to look at their people and find closure. We are very disappointed with that. And we are hoping that somebody who made that recommendation will come up and say, sorry, I made a mistake. The truth is, we were doing some precautions and we went overboard. And I think we will deal with that. But to sit here and say to our people, don't worry, the 43,000 people, if you multiply that by 5 family members, multiply that by 5. I'm not even talking about those who are relatives. I'm not even talking about those who are friends. Millions of our people are living with a deep wound because they were not able to say farewell to their friends the way we do. And we're saying to those who are scientific, please do not be blinded by science. Science is a gift, but science is not an answer to everything. There is some things that science cannot answer. And because we believe in faith, people are able to transcend then science and say science is the tool. But there are other ways to derive meaning. And that is where we are.
Dr. Molo, just before we go, about 2 minutes or 3 minutes left before I let you go through the honorable chair. The last comment that I would have, let me not even make it a question. Let me make it a comment. Then you can just respond to the comment directly. SACC, South African Council of Churches, is as an influence across a number of denominations. And we believe so that your greater part of your membership is actually an educated, progressive membership. Inclusive to that are politicians. Inclusive to that are scientists. Inclusive to that are educationists. The fraternities are countless. And as a South African Council of Churches, my comment, I was going to make it a question, but because of time, I'll make it into a comment. Is it possible, or will you make it possible, within your organization, I recommend that you gather together all the doctors, all the pharmacists, and all the professionals who are within your congregational influence, so that the solutions that we are looking for, instead of us always focusing on ministers who are more on the doctrinal side, those conferences have been organized from the Council of Nicene to date. We need now to change the South African Council of Churches into a medical consultative forum, into a pharmaceutical consultative forum, into a psychological consultative forum, so that the professionals who are within our religious space of influence can come together, can begin to discuss, and the protocols that the government is giving us, we as a church can actually begin to draft, design protocols that say, we as a people, we have 500,000 doctors here, and if they say that we can meet, and these are the requirements for meeting, then it's doable, so that we convert the organization from just being that of ecclesiastical, liturgical preservation into a psychosocial, religio, political, economic, conversation, so that we can engage the government as a body that represents the people.
Thank you. I can respond to that, Bishop. Firstly, Bishop, I'll just have a slight differentiation with you. The SACC is not for the preservation of liturgical and doctrinal traditions. We are, just call ourselves, we are trans-doctrinal. As I said to you, we've got Zionists there, we've got Methodists there, we've got Anglicans, we've got Catholics. So we are not there to preserve liturgies and doctrines, just that sense. Bishop, if you read the SACC, even before COVID, five years ago, we developed what we call the South Africa We Pray For. And in that South Africa We Pray For, there are things we identify as key areas of life. One of them is education, for example. And in that, we are making a call to our member churches to help us then facilitate a gathering of educationists who are going to help us reflect, even before the pandemic itself. The pandemic is going to make the thing worse. The reality is the education system in South Africa is not serving a poor child. It's actually designed in many ways to sideline that poor child. And if a poor child gets an A or 5 A's or 6 A's, we are in that little problematic space where the exception is elevated as a reflection of the norm. And therefore they take one child who is exceptional in some village, and they elevate that child to tell everybody else that if this child can do this, everybody should be doing that. And we are saying, no, the system itself is not geared towards helping young people to get to be educated. So we have reflected on that, and therefore, by the time we come to the pandemic, we've got a document that we call a pastoral response to the pandemic. And out of that document, Bishop, we are saying those who are scientific in our churches, for that matter, Bishop, we have suggested that every local community, every local church should consult its own members who are scientifically trained to make sure that they understand this thing at the local level. Because we do recognize, Bishop, that when we meet at the highest level, but we depend on people to take decisions in a meeting and send it somewhere. Our view was, make your scientists at the local level to be your biggest point of reference and speak about that so that we can generate from that an understanding. So a short answer is that strategy is part of what we seek to do. As I indicated, Bishop, earlier, the protocols that the SACC have developed were also protocols where we consulted scientists and said to scientists, we hear what Karim is telling us. Give us your honest, independent analysis of that. So we've engaged with them. So the point you're making is one that we take on board gladly because it is part of what we seek to pursue as we move into the future.
All right, I'll hand over to you so that we can take a small little short break. But from my desk, Honorable Reverend, I truly appreciate your presence today, and I'm very grateful. From the expressions that I'm hearing, I don't think we have lines of differences except what is exaggerated. I think I need to make a public announcement that I would want to have you in studio in the near future, and you can expound and share with us the great vision that you have as SACC. Over to you.
No, before you say goodbye, Bishop, you know the story, Bishop, of the Chuluba, who didn't want to resign, who did not want to step down. And he had a meeting with the former President Thabo Mbeki, and Thabo Mbeki goes to public and says, Chuluba has promised me he will resign. He will not contest the elections. You are binding me in the public, Bishop, so that I have no option out, Bishop.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Reverend Mwandile Milo. And so as we continue to chew on this, the truth is we are no different to the picture that is painted in the Bible of Israelites.
When we come back, I want to engage our indigenous psychologist here. Don't go away.
Can I just say something? I don't know. You might go for your advert. No. I want to say to Anele, and I want to speak because let me call it the overconfidence of Christianity. The overconfidence of Christianity has blinded some of us from the reality of models of healing and life that transcend what we perceive as truth.
Hold it right there. Hold it right there. Hold it right there. I think you encapsulate it well. The overconfidence of Christianity must never overshadow the impact of other methods of healing that we have from our history as we're moving into the future. Don't go away. We'll be back right after the break. And if Ntate Molo is still available, I will give him another minute or so. Let's see him having killing again. Please stay with us. We'll be back after the break.
Make massive moves.
Isn't that your daughter's bib?
But the truth is, I feel like Arabella's always with me.
Don't you ever forget this man's face. He killed your brother.
Don't shoot! Please don't shoot!
Make massive moves with Starsat. Make massive moves.
So from the theater stage to the kitchen.
anxiously awaiting to see Sanaya.
What else is this if not love?
Make massive moves with StarSat.
Thank you. Welcome one, welcome all. One more time here with Ntate. Let me try to see if my memory is good. Siswane, who is taking us through indigenous methods of healing. And we know that as a country and as a continent and the world over, this pandemic has presented to us new social, physiological and psychological, there's all ecology issues. People are hurting. Let me speak like a layman. People are hurting. And as a result, we are looking for methods of healing. And I think we lost our freedom in 2019. That the last time you could walk outside and go knock on a friend, there's a new neighbor, you could walk up there with a cake and etc. It looks like that time is long gone. Here we are with the professional psychologists in the house who take us through the cultural, modern, a little bit of religious space, and looking specifically at how, as Africans, I want to zoom into ourselves, how as Africans are we coping with the pandemic, and what sort of psychological, family, cultural support structures are we having to ourselves. Now, the other day I actually buried a friend, and the mother could not attend the funeral because the mother had COVID. And even when I got there, he's a good friend of mine. I could not even hug the sister I've known for years. The best thing was to give her, this karate shoulder. And a few days later, the mother passes away. And you get there and you have hardly healed over the death of a son. Now you must heal over the death, and people cannot come. Aunties cannot come. Worse still, as our Honorable Reverend was saying, we believe as Africans that the coffin must come and stay home for that night. The spirit must be in conversation with the walls where it used to stay before it is taken away. Now it is coming, parking on the side of the street, wrapped up in plastic and etc. We don't even have a chance of putting candles, and for that last night, moan, say whatever. Remember as Africans, we speak and say, it's part of healing. We empty that. Now you're looking at all these bottles of pain that people are actually having to themselves. And you, as a person who is doing counseling, this show is your show. For the next 30, 40 minutes, I want you to take us through the psychology of counseling, the psychology of mourning, the process of mourning. Focus your attention on the COVID-19 pandemic and how that is impacting on the African family. Better than that, how do we begin to mold new methods of African mourning as we are dealing with this pandemic and others that are coming after that? I don't know if you want to pile him up, and maybe just let's give him enough so that he can have a full dish. I want to give him a full bouquet.
Yeah, I think for me, Bishop, what has been the greatest gift out of COVID, I saw the benefit of my intersectionalities. One, I fully responded to my call for divinity in the ancestral world last year in September. I've always had this conviction that I was called for ministry. I almost studied theology to become a Methodist minister. And it was the other way around, and the Gogos said, no ways, it's fine, but we want the first one, the Gogos one. So ever since then, I assumed a new identity as Mkhulu. One that is still undergoing initiation to understand the doctrines, the ethics, the language of the ancestral world, of the spirit world, that for the longest time, I remember it has been denounced as something demonic. it as something that is wrong. But I struggled with navigating these two worldviews. Being raised Christian, made to understand Christianity, but my conviction says, but I've always been with these people, they know me before and all of that, and I always like to use that scripture that says...
before I knew you, Jeremiah.
Even my ancestors knew me, right?
Absolutely.
So before they were doing, as they were doing their packages, right? So they knew that this is my package to undergo this route. So from that perspective, Bishop, and I trained at a very Eurocentric university, Rhodes. There, I was only given one Western Eurocentric understanding a human being, which is very psychoanalytic. Freud.
So you studied psychology?
I studied psychology. Okay. I've got a master's degree in clinical psychology.
So you want to shrink me now?
I can do anything. So
they call you shrinks. They will squeeze you.
Is that my worldview has always been Eurocentric in how I'm trained, in how I understand the world and everything else around me. So now there am I, raised Christian. I understand theology. I studied a bit of introduction to theology. I'm like, okay, fine, we'll pack it for some other time. Then and again, on top of that, I'm queer. You can imagine.
You're
queer. I mean, I'm gay.
Queer.
That's what it's called, queer, Bishop. Story for another conversation. What it means to be queer, being gay.
Oh, you're gay also?
I'm gay.
All right.
I am a psychologist who happens to be gay. Okay. Not a gay psychologist.
I was really excited about your profession, and I was actually, now you drop in a bomb. You knock me off my. Even the guys in the back office are laughing.
I'm gay.
Your expression, Bishop.
I'm gay. I'm Inyangi, Adlozi. I am a trained clinical psychologist. I'm a preacher, a Methodist preacher who studied theology. Right. I'm an academic, right? Okay. So these are the complexities of my identity, but I love them.
Complex, yeah.
For me, they're not. Yeah. They are part of my being that happens to be.
But politely, I'm saying you're complex. Politely, I'm saying you're complex because you bring you in your CV, you give us these elements which actually then someone warms up towards that. Then boom, you read someone says, hey. Bite your teeth a little bit. We got another issue. By the way, in all respect, I mean, with
I enjoy your
with Mfundisi Piri and Bomuyema and my gay sagas in the South African Council and Human Rights. You know better.
No, I know. I'm not even. You're actually one person that society needs. You're a destabilizer. You make us uncomfortable to think beyond what normative standards of living, which is something that I'm one person that I'm not a follower. Only Jesus from that perspective, but I'm one person that you must know from today. I love your controversy because it helps us to think of, we would not think of these possibilities had it been for one dogmatic way of looking at the world.
And also bearing in mind that it is a colonial and a post-colonial, neo-colonial. These guys come with all these weird words. Sometimes I end up not even knowing what I'm talking about, trying to define myself.
And the beautiful thing about Bishop is that you've got the theological, socio-political language to create these discourses.
No, thank you.
So no one can, because you understand Christianity, its principles and fundamentals and its doctrines. However, you looked at them, which is similar to what we studied in psychology. Freud said all of these things.
Yeah, your life is about sex.
And then came Carl Jung said, no, you're forgetting the spirit. You're forgetting the soul. Then came, so what about...
The African comes and says, you're forgetting the social.
What about Bishop Maponga who says, no, our cosmology does not only end when we bury this, right? There's a transcendence of this to the spirit. So it's all in people with Maponga that I don't cry when someone dies, at least for now, because I understand this person is given a chance to negotiate what it means to live this, to transcend to the other world.
But now, Anil, I want to go back to what the bishop was asking.
Great.
How have people been able to process everything that is happening?
Okay.
But also, let's even speak about the funerals.
No, you don't overload. Let's start here.
So, looking at all of these intersections, for me, I have understood what people want in South Africa. My practice is booming because people want a psychologist that is able to understand the impact of African identities in the way of how we understand. I come and I work with people, Bishop, who say, I've lost my father, head of the house. For instance, yesterday I had someone who says, my father came to me in her dreams and said, I'm not well rested. Because he came covered in a black plastic, and the box was covered, wrapped in a plastic. They couldn't do what we call ukapa nokubuyisa, that is, when one dies, we slaughter a cow to send their spirit and to bring back that spirit. Now, she says, it's very difficult for me to grieve because this meant for him to rest in peace or rest well, and for him to be an effective ancestor. There's a ritual. So we focused on the funeral, but the rituals that we had to do are the cause of my psychological distress. Now,
spiritual distress. It's a new definition.
Spiritual
I must do my master's on spiritual depression. I mean, we talk about psychological depression, but right now as a country, we are in a spiritual depression.
So I have people who then have a lot of these things. A number of significant deaths has happened, but people, they do not have the time, number one, to process loss from a point of a psychological loss, because we don't, again, we're given 3-4 days for this to happen. It's so quick. We are not focusing on honoring the person.
Not all can come?
Not all can come.
Only 20?
It's only 20, 15, all of that. Even with the 50 that's here, we have to socially distance, right? We've got to social distance. We've got to bury this person like we're shoving off this person.
It's dead.
And then we
throwing it away.
We must forget about that. Now, who's next?
Can I share a joke? But not a joke, actually, it's more serious. I got 2 calls, actually. 2 calls last week, where because the family could not even see who was being buried.
Yeah.
They had the wrong body. They gathered to bury a wrong person.
Wrong person.
Because the family cannot even see what is in the box. At the end of the day, it's from the morgue to the undertakers to your family. And there a mistake happens, one story. Number 2, other hints are coming out of body parts harvesting, bone marrow harvesting, corneas, livers, and other things, because now the family cannot even have a look at the body. So the doctors and the people who are in the medical fraternities have freedom with the cadaver to harvest what they want to harvest, stitch up, wrap up in plastic, deliver this thing to your door, and you guys must just go and throw away. So at the end of the day, you're actually dealing with 2 devils, wrong identities and body parts harvesting, all happening in the armpit.
But even that, for me, I think with all of these regulations, and there are reservations that funeral parlors, they do not capacitate families to understand, because there's a protocol that is there. For instance, I fought for my sister's funeral. It was just the beginning of COVID. So what happened, it was a sudden death. We don't know exactly what happened. No, we were then told, number one, we're not going to do, because at home we are very traditional about dressing someone,
washing them,
all of those things. So now, what the death certificate said, they said
COVID.
No, it said natural causes.
Okay.
Now we get to one of the funeral policies. What fine? The body was transferred from PE to Mount Frere, and we were told, my grandmother, you can't do anything with this body. It's wrapped and sealed, done deal.
But it's natural causes.
Natural causes, right? Now, when we got home on the night before, I'm fine with us being told that we cannot bring the body at home. But there's a condition here. The death certificate says natural causes.
It's not COVID.
That's not COVID. Bishop Maponga,
if it is natural, then we deal with it naturally.
I tell you, Bishop Maponga, the level of ill treatment we got from the funeral parlor. So I said, I spoke to my attorney, said, help me on this one. It was on a night before. We are told if we want to at least see her face, we need the full attire. Where are we going to get that in Mount Fred? At night. So I said to this guy, there's only one condition. If you want to see me in court, we don't mind. We can wait until we cannot bury, it's fine. But you have a reservation. Your doctors declared my sister as dead due to natural causes. So if you don't have anything that says COVID, Bishop Maponga, I personally, I've never seen a dead body. We went to the funeral parlor and I said, I have all the legal evidence. I printed all the protocols that said you need at least 2 people. These are the regulations that
you dressed everything, you met the requirements.
I got there, my sister was lying outside, faced by the sun. They just opened the coffin and said, there she is. So these people who work at the funeral, they don't have any emotional attachment to this thing that is disposable for instance. It's more like a disposable body for them. Bishop Maponga, for me, for our family to be able to, the 3 of us, to say at least it's here at least, we had to involve a legal advisor just to read the protocols so that he understands. So people are denied their rights and privileges. To mourn. And what you're saying, that doctors, even in the state, if I got involved in an accident, it's going to always be COVID related. On what? When was the autopsy done? For all of these things. So we are deprived by the state and some of these regulations that are not read. And that causes so much psychological distress. Right? We are not able to do all of these rituals and things that people deem them as indigenous therapeutic ways for me to know that my father has rested in peace. These things have not been done, right? Even a mere tombstone. In the rural area, some people are told you can't do that. Some they just say it's a drive-through from the funeral parlor straight to the grave. I mean, the level of inhumanness is what also causes distress, that our people are treated like just, it's garbage that it must just go to.
In the world of psychology, in the world of counseling, what's the value of body contact?
It's closure. At least, most of the time this person, Bishop, left, they had minor symptoms. And now the new thing, if someone leaves as a result of these symptoms, chances are they're not coming back.
Actually, with all due respect, I know some people out there who are too excited. One call me a conspiracy theorist, but enjoy yourselves. But in terms of percentages right now, it is true. The figures can confirm. If you leave the house, I've buried 8 people last week.
Sure.
And all of them left the house walking. Go to the hospital. One had diabetes, the other one had other condition and whatever. They left the house. And by the way, where we're coming from, they've lived with these diseases for the longest of time.
Yes.
And you walk into hospital now, you come back dead.
So for psychologically, when they say, and you immediately this person leaves, you've started to moan unconsciously, because there's COVID, there's hospital, and you can even know. Now we even charge, okay, private, public. Well, probably private. Chances
may
are
survive.
May
Public,
survive. You've already started
start buying food.
That this person is not coming back. So psychologically, that shifts our now and again. Who do we put blame on? And again, I like what Mfundisi spoke about, Reverend Molo. When we talk of God, what kind of God is this brutal, right? Already I'm engaging with this God who's going to take my closest person, and chances are this person is not coming back. They get to hospital. We don't know whatever that then happens because we can't even see these people. So now, body contact for us as African, take us to that point where we can at least have closure to say, indeed, you must rest. You can rest well. Now, I haven't done that process. I still have that memory lingering of this person having left home and there's not been any closure. Even on the day of the funeral, still I'm left and scarred that I don't have the memory that at least you can see, okay, this person is quiet, or there's just something about body in an African context. Now we then talk of, we have buried this person. There is hope that this person has I saw one of my friends who lost his father. He said, yes, I'm crying in the flesh, but in the spirit I've gained a powerful ancestor. But now, how do I come to that conviction?
When we come back after the break with Ntate Sisiwane here, taking us through some deep spiritual, psychological closure issues around African spirituality. Quite interesting and quite exciting, and we all cry in different methods. The most unfortunate part that we are facing with the government and social structures is that we've been taught to cry in a white form, this colonial way of crying. Now even that small little titty we're given on our lips has been pulled away from us. And here we are, as a people now, we can't do culture. Even the Eurocentric methods of crying are impossible. Political systems and health professionals, scientists are telling us that you can't touch, you can't come close, you can't what? There are lots of errors that are happening in the system. How are we coping, South African and African community and the world at large, during this time of the pandemic, with our social psychologist in the house, also Mkulu Sisiwane, taking us through some paces. And when we come back after the break, we want the process of grieving. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
To eat healthy food because it's delicious.
Make massive moves.
Would you like another one?
I love it.
I love this soup. This is amazing. The grits are so creamy. Oh.
I take pride in my grits.
So flavorful.
I think that looks wonderful.
Yeah.
It's so incredible.
Make massive moves with Starside. Make massive moves.
Bible is human and divine.
It's important for us to remember.
And I'm part of God's story.
Yeah, mama, hey.
God is healing you.
God says what he means, and he means what he says.
God is good.
I am very grateful to God. I am healed. Amen.
Make massive moves with Starside.
Only those who have accepted death can they begin to do a living. Those who are scared of death still think that they're going to die. And as Africans, of course, people are saying, hey, you're going to die one day and go to hell. Hey, get over it. We're already in hell. We're already in hell. We're in economic hell, political hell, and we're in a health hell. You know, for what it is worth, start accepting and prepare yourself. And guys, this pandemic is real. Disasters and the impact are visible. And some of you guys are still thinking around, hey, funeral policy, funeral. You're going to be rich after you're dead. Get a life, guys. Get a life. Go home, kiss your wife, kiss your children, read them a story. Make it worth a while. What if this is all you have? You know, are you still going to be thinking of 10, 15, 20 years from now? And we have no guarantee of what's happening. I mean, if you look at the type of people who are passing away right now, honestly, I lost a friend last week, Bongile Kumalo, a famous musician. I was speaking to you the other week. We're laughing our lungs out and still talking about what we are going to do. And boom, You wake up one morning, it's gone. And here we are, sitting around and still having a schedule. 10 years from now, 15 years from now, I'm going to be working, and then I'm going to, and we don't have that space. But anyway, that's my frustration. You were asking me over the break. I want you to take us through you, Honorable Chair, so they can also put your contribution. Stages of psychological healing for the person, family healing, community healing, and maybe I'm just looking at this as a ripple effect. An event happens, its impact, the person who directly is involved is disabled. It's a wife, it's a husband, for example. You have to stop for those couple of weeks trying to deal with that. Your children are nearby. The employers are involved. The community is involved. Ultimately, the death of a person has emotional, psychological, and spiritual waves that it actually, though they are not, we don't have a measuring tool where we, like a metrometer, where we can say how big is this impact. But my grief as a person, all of a sudden my contracts, my suppliers, everyone hears, sorry. And that impact is there. I wonder maybe as a professional in this space to look at when this drop of water drops on a quiet lake, oops, onto the ground, onto the water, and as the ripple begins to go across, before it can be calm again, how is that impact? How is the influence around it? And finally, how long and what does it take again to look on a lake and it is calm, that life can continue as usual?
Yeah, maybe something to start on. You mentioned something about economic health, and South Africa needs a very strategic, holistic and systemic plan on mental health. There is no time that psychologists, social workers, and counselors are needed because of that which you said, that people have no psychological resources and tools to use on how to process this death. I mean, it's ripple effects on many levels. At a point of death, where we lose people, number one, we lose breadwinners, people who bring income and all of that. Now, as you say, there's no one who's got a luxury now of saying, I'm working towards my retirement annuity or whatever that you have. Probably if you can access on your retirement annuity, you're probably thinking, I'd rather withdraw that money before, because I don't know what can happen tomorrow. So for me as a psychologist, in terms of delving deeper into stages of grief and mourning for our people, I think because of these also structural protocols, by virtue of that, we're limited on what we can do. We can't have physical contact of people coming in to do family prayers. We've got to do that on our own. Even when we are doing it on our own, we're doing it in our separate rooms, because chances are we may infect each other. Number two, we don't have access to see psychologists. And number three, even the simplest things to do, if you don't have money to see a therapist, what are you going to do? If you don't have access to social workers, what are you going to do? Now you are worried. I mean, I call ourselves, we're a worried society, because we're worried about being worried. You're worried about coughing. You're worried about cold. You're worried about not having food. You're worrying about not having money for medication.
Now children, imagine children, we are paying school, they got mad during the COVID thing. I remember my wife sending me an SMS, she has paid school fees.
Right.
14K. Then next month again, she has paid school fees.
Yes.
And these kids are sitting at me at home looking at me and saying,
they're doing homeschooling.
For crying out loud, what am I paying for? Kids are not in class, but I'm paying school fees.
Imagine, Bishop, you are worried and frustrated. You have the money to pay for that. Now we are at home, we've lost someone, there's no income coming, we are poor. All of these other psychosocial factors that contribute to, where do I get the time to cry when I need to think of the next meal? Right? Here's a wife, the man has gone, or the wife who was the breadwinner is gone. I have to be worried about kids. I have to be worried about all of these other things. Chances are that person would have a psychological breakdown. Sure. Where do they go to? Even psychiatric hospitals are full. Right? to see a psychologist, to see a psychiatrist.
Maybe I don't want to strain you. Yeah. I want to bring him back, Chief, with your permission. I want to bring you back on the South African mental health state, because the last time I checked, we were saying 20-30% of South African community in general,
definitely
post-trauma of war and the effects of that. Sure. It almost puts 30% of the South African community to be exposed, some of them directly or indirectly, or pre-exposed conditions of mental illness. Yeah. And if that is true, then 30% of our police, 30% of our army, 30% of our doctors, 30% of our teachers,
and
30% of our parliamentarians are psychological patients.
Even as psychologists, we are psychological.
30% of the psychologists,
and we kill ourselves. The rate of suicide among psychologists is quite very high.
You don't talk to anybody, you guys. You're supposed to know it all.
We do. I, for one, I am under psychological treatment. I see my psychiatrist for depression, because there's no way, Bishop Maponga, I've even lost count how many patients I've seen. And the impact of that. So every second week I've got to see my therapist. I don't talk about my problem, about tissue. I talk about my own psychological distress, my own worries. As a young man in his 30s who's trying to figure out life and all of these other things. And Bishop Maponga, as a breadwinner at home, I'm worried about.
But how do you breadwin now when you are
black tax?
When you have a husband, why are you worrying about?
No, it's my family. My husband has got his own stuff.
Okay.
But I'm still a son. I'm still a brother.
But I think even within your space, it's important also to clarify that.
I know him. I mean, he's got a husband, so I'm saying at least he has a bit of stress to say someone else must be worrying about it. You know?
But the bills that Bishop Maponga. Last year, I had to sit with my advisor and say, can you please increase this funeral policy in premiums? Because I know when someone dies,
it's going to impact you.
Right. So now I'm no longer focused on
yourself.
On myself. I'm focused on measures that I need to put in place so that when something happens, I'm worried about my mom who's in her 60s, who is ill, who whenever she needs something, I've got to always give it to her because I'm worried about health.
Let me ground you again one more time. Take us through the process of grieving with the psychology. We have more than 42 countries, people watching you around the face of Africa, and maybe their funerals, as we're talking right now, there could be programs that are running. Someone has lost a relative, someone has lost a brother and a father, maybe just psychologically. If you have a chance of looking at them right now, I would ask you to look straight into the camera and say, when you're going through this process, do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever it is supposed to be. Just coping mechanisms.
Like as you've said, coping mechanism number one, as we've said, that number one, you need to use the resources that are accessible in front of you. If you've got 50 people that can help you to cope with that, you focus on those 50 people in trying to figure things out. Okay, how do we make sure that we make sure the funeral gets done with the funeral? Then after the funeral, how do we support each other? Because again, we must understand that grieving is subjective. I may not think that Cloney is passed over this death over a week or so. We spoke about the longevity that it takes for some Africans to mourn and all of that. We need to have practical family meetings to say, it's going to take us 3 months. At the back of our minds, in retrospect, we know it's supposed to take a year. We can't do these rituals and all of that. We can wait. But what we can do for now, to let go of the situation, let's focus on the funeral. After the funeral, who needs support, who needs help? We focus on building on our immune systems. And there's nothing much that we can do much more than making sure that we take our vitamins and everything else that we need to do. So it's medical. Take care of your medical health. Take care of your psychological health. If you have access to medical aid, access to seeing psychologists, see that. The simplest thing that you can do, create your own spiritual disciplines at home. That you don't need this physical contact because it's not there. At the same time, make sure that you consider yourself as a priority. your grieving process may take longer than the other. But what's difficult now is that we're losing people every day. We don't even have the time to crash. And Hloni mentioned something about what are the ripple effects of these unprocessed grieving processes. As you said, it's 8 people. Each person meant something to you. So how then now do I create space and reservation for honoring these people? For doing things that will make me honor these people without me putting a strain on myself and finding it difficult to move on. So that's basically what I can say for now.
No, you've been quiet for quite some time.
No. I'm actually thinking as Mwandile is speaking right now, because I also want to leverage on the fact that Mwandile is undergoing initiation and find out what are the intersections. Are there any intersections between the psychological impact and then the spiritual impact of going through death, losing a breadwinner for some families without being able to grieve properly?
It's a very difficult thing. Again, for us as initiates, you can't go to the funeral, right? You can't go to a place where there's death. So there's also that you need to find a way, a resolute way to say, okay, I've lost this person. The least you can go is your direct, immediate mother or father that you can bury. But friends and all of that you can't. But even spiritually, in this process there, you are deprived of many other things that you cannot do. And then now with this pandemic, it's even much more. There are certain rituals that you need to do to move to the second phase.
Sure.
That need your family, that need people around you. So you can't. So it means I will stay at Petlweni for a whole year because
where would have stayed 6 months,
where
8 months,
6 months or 8 months. The psychological impact of that, number one, I'm worried about money that I need to pay my Govela for me to be able to do my initiation school. You're worried about your health. You are with these people. It's a new construct, a new worldview. But what I've discovered is that I'm much more connected to myself and my ancestors because I have 24/7 access to my ancestors that I can always go and partner, connect with them, at least for my psychological well-being. But I feel that there's also strain in that regard, as I've mentioned, that people, we don't have the time and leverage to say, by April I would know now everything is in order. Now I've got a strain of budget. I've got, like this morning I was rearranging with my Govela to say, Govela, it's not going to work for me to be there every day because you've got your family, I've got my family, I've got demands.
Plus corona restrictions.
Corona restrictions as well.
Yeah.
You can't even be in her house.
Sure.
Because we're about...
You have to Govela you with remote now.
That's
virtually.
She has been very proactive in the ways of how she does training with us. And again, she's open-minded to the idea that as conservative ancestors they can be, we must start now learning on... the first thing we check in the morning via WhatsApp and WhatsApp video calls because we can't be with her physically. Sure. But she has understood that there's nothing that's going to change about your dreams when you're at my house and when you're at your house.
Sure.
You follow these protocols the way they are. When we meet, we do what we're supposed to do and you go home. So she has developed different interesting ways of saying, this is how.
But is she adapting? She's accommodating?
She's very accommodating and she's young, she's educated, she understands that ancestors again are omnipresent, so they can operate anywhere.
And they're already in technology because the spiritual world is.
She understands that
7 IR. Right? We are still struggling with 4. These guys are on 7.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So spiritually, it's a journey, and again, it challenges Gobelas, initiators,
and pastors,
think
and
of
theologians,
a different
everyone.
way of how again she's going to teach us on how to do virtual consultation. Because
while you're on that, you just mentioned something, just so
Sure.
to punch it. You mentioned something very critical. The change of the social terrain. While you're talking about the Govela story, I blurted out and said pastors.
Sure.
And immediately after saying that, I can also blurt out doctors.
Sure.
Now you can have it under technology, nanotechnology. A doctor sitting in Paris can actually do an operation in Cape Town.
Yeah.
On a mouse. They can be given a computer and get a patient and cut the patient while they're sitting in their office and do that. And I'm even thinking further now that even our political structures, which have been right now campaigning on buying T-shirts and caps for people, Corona pandemic opens up a whole new arena of adapting, changing. It's a metamorphosis from elementary ways of doing things to usher in this 4, 5G, 5 IRA, 6 IRA. I wrote a paper the other day on 7 IRA. How do we begin actually? Because it would be stupid for us to think about 4 IRA. The question is, what is 5? Absolutely. And what is 6? And what is 7? I might as well get to 7 and then think backwards so that the technology I'm buying in 4 can be relevant in 6 to 7. And in 7.
Yeah. So, and which also makes me think, how do we think about grief differently using technology?
For me, that also is very important, Anela, because then do our indigenous processes have any way of accommodating how we could bring in the virtual space to that? Because now we spoke to the church tells us that we've got ways of reaching out virtually. But now when it comes to our processes of grief, as someone who is born in my belly anyway, there is the specific things that we need to do when a person has passed on that we cannot do on online platforms. How do we work around that?
Just I'm thinking out loud now. One of the things that I do, and I think people, going to Umsamo to speak to this person that is late, to say, okay, this is a, you know, you left. I mean, there was a thing that ancestors are complaining about, mask and being.
What does it need for money, Kulu?
Doesn't need So this person left. And again, these ancestors who died in COVID times, probably they will be the most proactive ancestors, right?
Because
you know, you left knowing what the situation looks like now. Yeah. So when you go to Msamo, anyone can create Msamo.
I wish I had brought some papers here. I wanted us to do a ceremony just to tell bonke bogogo nabomkhulu abahambe necorona. Sicelani news bigela on the other side. Zishubile ngapha, you know, things are no longer as easy as
and I wonder, Bishop, what happens to the other crowd, the other entourage, that those ones who left in ancient times, to the entourage of those who are coming wrapped in plastics?
It's interesting. That's what I'm saying. Spestela group, le 2019, 2020. Would please, when you go on the other side, tell them SMS. Don't come back to us as ancestors and say, hey, you
must understand.
Alcohol now. How are we going to appease you?
When there's a ban.
When there's a, I can't even buy it.
I don't give a but isimo asivumi because ya tumeli SMS ne emoji at your rest in peace.
But Bishop, you know, just to really bring it back, you know, I was speaking to my grandmother recently. When you hear the hurt that she's holding on to because she has not been able to grieve loved ones.
Yes.
Because the most logical thing to do, one would imagine under such circumstances, is to say, let the young ones go bury whoever needs to be buried and let
Abokoko is better immune. They are alive.
But the challenge is, a lot of us have been keeping them at home. We've been keeping them at home.
Their immune is well and good.
Unfortunately, it's now we think
medical aids.
We are the problem.
The 30 years to 45, 50 years.
True.
It's like, but the trauma, and again, we've not been able to bury loved ones.
With us, the young ones, we'd rather not tell our parents when we're ill.
Yes.
Because it's going to be another effect. So with that, I mean, we constantly live with anxiety and fear of losing our loved ones because we know there's no coming back. So I personally have adjusted these old imaginations of lifelong span. I've cut it out. It's out of my picture. But at least I've got resources and things that can make it easier for me.
Sure.
But for others who struggle to even manage the basic things of life, it's very difficult. Now for Gogo, I understand. And other community could be like, Gogo, if you happen to pass, how do you want me to honor you when you are dead?
And so I like what you're saying. I like what that's very critical. That counseling and grieving and mourning must not happen at the event of the loss and the coffins are here. Because the one inside the coffin is no longer talking. The correct way of mourning the dead is speaking to the living.
How do you want me to honor you?
I'm building on what you've just said.
How do you want me to honor you? Because the situation is, if Gogo...
How do you want your funeral to be like? What do you want us to do? Da, 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 da. And even if you have a relative now, a father, a mother, a sister, and etc., who has COVID, who is in a critical condition. I know in terms of African culture, it might be deemed as if you cannot plan my funeral and I'm still living. But remember, due to restrictions, you may not have the opportunity to foreclosure.
Sure.
Because you won't have another chance to have a conversation. So when someone is ill, someone has got terminal illnesses, someone has got a COVID infection, someone is in an ICU, someone is in a critical condition, you better make that opportunity when they are still alive to access, and grieving needs to start at a moment of conversation so that come boom, the event is now here.
In fact, how do we grieve and honor Inyangi Zangoma? Because there are certain rituals that have to be done for, I mean, it's like two funerals at one time.
Sure.
So I, as Inyang and someone who's in this process, I would want, as an ancestor, I will have reasonable expectations. Right? So you do what you can, the rest you'll honor me after. You can do all the other things, but now, basic funeral. Because that's all that we can give you.
And it's important for people to speak to you and find this about you.
Yes.
Find this out and know, Uguti, you're okay for them to just do the one process and suspend the other.
Because now there's no time. One, you're given time restrictions, right? In the beginning, I mentioned all of these other identities that I have. So it means we'll have a long day funeral. So now, 1 hour, what if I want to be cremated?
Now that you mentioned that, at the rate at which right now funerals are taking off in South Africa in particular, maybe we might need to visit that 1.5 million graves that the South African government dug. Whether it was culturally right or not, it's a conversation for another day.
Great.
But with so many deaths that are happening and the impact on estate, that we're going to end up with 10, 15, 20 hectares of graves, which you cannot use for business, you can't use for agriculture, you can't use for housing. It's just supposed to be graves. And I'd recommended the other day, actually. I said, how about if each family that has lost a relative in the graveyard can just go to the grave and plant a tree next to the grave? Then what you do is that 20, 30 years later, these actually become forests. At least you can say from the forests, we can get fruits if you plant an avocado.
And ancestors live in forests there?
Yes. Imagine the beauty.
But are there no cultural problems there, Bishop? Because there are things, so for instance, I come from a family where in the Eastern Cape, up until recently, we still buried people in our backyard.
Like for me,
and it was a very important place for our family. It was a very important place for some of our ceremonies.
Now, I'm looking already with the cosmopolitan space.
Great.
Where we're already having Mamelodi, Athlon with Soweto. Where you actually, I stood the other day on the freeway looking at this whole field of concrete. So here's the idea. How about you listening to me right now? You go back to your grandfather's grave or your mother's grave or your father's grave and plant a tree on the graveyard.
Instead of a tombstone?
Instead of a tombstone.
How would I know when I come back?
You can still put a tombstone, but I'm saying the idea is I'm not worried about the concrete. I want us to focus on the planted tree.
Great.
Say it's a fruit tree.
It's a fruit tree, yeah.
Say it's a furniture tree. Whatever type of a tree. 20, 30 years later, this whole concrete block has become a forest. The birds have returned. Fruits can be found here. You can actually walk up to your own grandfather's grave and come back home with a plastic of avocados from your grandfather. I'm trying to find another way of actually re-experiencing and relive, instead of having concrete blocks and tombstones
that have been wasted.
And this becomes a quarantine space where nothing happens. And imagine, if that is so, who will come and cut a tree on your grandfather's grave?
Definitely, yes.
So it also talks about preservation. I'm just thinking out loud. Pardon my mind has got tendencies of flying out into...
I like what Tony spoke about. Like even in my family, in Mount Frey, this practice is still there. You bury it at home. right? Even at home, we have got a section, Bishop,
in the homestead,
where we know that this is. And I, for one, I said to even before COVID, don't stress yourself.
Dump me here.
I have a home.
You have 2 minutes. You have 2 minutes as we're closing the show. 2 minutes for you. What do you want to tell Africa out there? Don't know what about him. He is coming back. Let's talk. And he's talking about his initiation. I was going to still talk about your initiation. What are you initiated into? Life is about initiations. But anyway, that's what
no
one can run away from it.
It's a conversation for another day. Yeah. But what
Africa is listening to you as a young person.
As a young person, what I can say is that the pandemic has offered us an opportunity to move from a model of church-centered, home-supported ministry. For the longest of time, we have been outsourcing the well-being and the spirituality of young people to the church. And when you look at the hours, it is very impossible. You come to church at most 52 weeks a year, which is 52 hours a year. And you try to compare that little grain that has been planted against all the other social influences. We are playing games. However, if we take this opportunity that the pandemic has presented us with to say, let us now move and have the church support home-centered ministry. The questions you're asking to Reverend Molo, very important questions. How do we enable parents at home to be the one that carry out ministry in the home space? In that way, it is very original ministry. I sometimes look at my own father and I say, I am this man. Even habits I do not like about him. And
slowly you're becoming that.
I look at them and I'm like, Jesus, I am this man. But that is how organic home-centered ministry is in comparison to the model that we have been using. It is flawed, it has been found wanting, but we are presented with an opportunity to actually fix it.
That is the Tlokonolo from Grace Point down here in Four Ways in South Africa. When you're in South Africa, please feel free to, in the post-COVID, or get them on the internet and social spaces. Doesn't Tatele Tlokonolo from Grace Point in Four Ways. And your last parting shot with the African community at large, both on cultural, social, and spiritual platform.
I think for me, COVID has given a space for integrating the space for Western Eurocentric ways of doing therapy, which there's still space for it, but also the African-centered. I am of this view, COVID has given us grounds of African-centered therapeutic approaches that are not necessarily that one sit by the couch, tell me how you feel. We engage with realities of cosmology. We engage with realities of what happens when I move from now to the other world. How do we think about inheritance? How do we think about all of these other things? But I believe that we need to create avenues where people have access to psychologists, have access to, which even makes me think now that I can't be using the same model of expensive fees at 1.3 that can feed a whole family. I now need to think about how do I create space and access for therapy for people to access me. One person said, Mkulu, I saw on your Instagram page where Mkulu and all of that. Can you be able to bring me to that space without me being in your office? So I want to come to you, Ndumba, and consult at a lesser price, but I still want to experience the psychological, because what I'm experiencing is still also psychological. So how then do I think about helping people to do grief for those ones that they feel that they've had so much impact in their life and now they've transcended to the other world? How do I help them then to integrate the beginning and the end through this kind of...
Well, thank you very much all for joining us on this wonderful program of SANKOFA. The pandemic has given all of us, Africa at large, and in specific Africa, we have an opportunity of beginning to develop spirituality as a personal business. And I remember the old preachers going, do you accept Jesus as a personal savior? They never presented him as, do you accept Jesus as a corporate savior? Do you accept Jesus as a denominational savior? And I think the time for that small little word at the beginning, the personal, that personal part has to deal with you beginning to couch for yourself, design for yourself your own spiritual environment within your own home. Remember, you're an individual. Create those spaces. Make the time to be spiritually connected. Invite your loved ones, your wife, your husband, your children into your space. As time allows, get the community into that space. And slowly but surely, we can begin to build a community around ourselves that speaks to each other, not only economically, but can also speak to each other spiritually. We're all going through a spiritual depression right now. Please write to us. Share your stories with us. Tell us how you are coping spiritually. How are you coping with your grief? As for me, I do art, I do beads, and etc. When I feel stressed, I go to my indumba at the back of my house. I start couching things. I start putting some glues. I start knocking some stuff, and I start beading something, making some hats, and etc. Those 4, 5, 6 hours of isolation as I'm working on these small little details. I switch off my phone. I switch off my WhatsApp, playing music in the background, and I'm able to heal myself, because every healer must be healed. And I hope you have enjoyed this show that we have shared with you with Ntateli Tlokonolo and Ntateli Sisiwane and our honorable guest Ntate Molo, who joined us by virtual space. When we come again, we'll be meeting you on Monday morning for another beautiful, beautiful, wonderful show. But please, we have another few other shows that are lined up for you for this afternoon, including Politiki and other programs that are coming through. Ntate's Fiso. From your host for this afternoon, Maponga J. Joshua Mwana wa Sose, ndi Mwana wa Marara, Mwana wa Mnyuki Chigaramboko. Garamashamba huda chirira n'abantu babe banje tisubo ho khwiro bana matanga kugara bana chigarama kwa matanda novora chikuchitedza chinotedzera uri kuri pedo ntambana cho mutamburi paro wara anompembera na machira machena wira miti ya sose masose tinorya mani mani tichibovera tisu bana chiramba kusesera mpanango kubane macha kumagara. Until we see again, don't do what I wouldn't do, but if you decide to do it better.